The mechanism is essentially that you are saying to a student, we believe in you. And that's why we are giving you this scholarship. And mind you, the two groups that were recipients of the scholarship, both groups were very poor. But one group, we say, okay, you will receive it because we believe your household needs support. We believe that you need this money, basically. That's the poverty one. And the other one, we say, the implicit message was, we believe that you can do the work, that we believe in you, in your ability. And that triggered a very different response. The merit one had impacts on cognitive, even if those merit were among the poorest of the poorest.
Yes.
So that is fascinating.
My guest today is Felipe Barrera, Associate Professor of Public Policy, Education, and Economics here at Vanderbilt in our Peabody School of Education. Felipe has a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland, College Park, USA, and a degree in economics from the University of the Andes, Bogota, Colombia. Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity and discovery. My name is Cybele Raver, and I serve as the Provost of Vanderbilt University. As a leader in higher education and as a social scientist, I believe that we can transform higher education for the 21st century. At my core, I am wildly curious about other people's work, whether it's in science, the social sciences, the humanities, or the arts. This podcast gives us the opportunity to break open new ideas through discovery and creative expression. Barrera-Osorio traveled to the United States in 2006 to work as a senior economist at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Between 2011 and 2020, he was an assistant professor and later an associate professor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. Since 2020, he has joined Vanderbilt University as an associate professor. We're so thrilled to have him in all the ways that he really enriches our understanding of education in global contexts. He's a founding member and co-director of the Network of the Evaluation of Impact. One thing that's really super impressive to me is you're also a visiting researcher at the Abdul, Latif, Jameel Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, at MIT. I'm really excited to have us dig in and learn about what that means and what it tells us in terms of the impact of your work in the wider world. So welcome, Felipe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great. So Felipe, you take on these really huge questions about how nations and districts run schools and how they structure educational opportunities for students. You ask questions such as, are school policies and programs really effective in shaping our ability or our willingness to attend school, work hard in school, and how much we learn? Or is it the case that those experiences that we have in school are fundamentally shaped by students' own characteristics like grit, or by family resources, like how much time or money families can spend or contribute to supporting their children's education? These are obviously questions that were true to my own area of research in early childhood here in the United States, and I'm fascinated to learn about how you see that through a global lens in countries as diverse as Cambodia, Mexico, and of course, Colombia. Do school policies lead us not only to stay in school, but do those policies lead us to have better jobs and happier lives? And I love that you ask that second question about people's happiness, not just what they're earning. I think it's a really important contribution in the field. So you carry out these incredibly careful policy experiments in low and middle income countries to try to disentangle those many factors. You're internationally known for your work on public-private partnerships in Bogota, in Colombia, and I can't wait to dive into that. But first, I actually want to back up so that our audience, so that people listening feel a closer understanding to what we mean when we say policy experiments and what we mean even when we say low and middle income countries.
Very good.
Great. So first, can you just tell us a little bit about your experience in low and middle income countries? I thought perhaps we might start with Cambodia. What's it like to collect data there? What is families' experience of their own earnings, their own income? What do we mean when we say low and income countries?
Collecting data in Cambodia, as in many other countries, is super difficult. It's a exercise in which you need to go usually to rural areas, and traveling in those countries is especially challenging. If things like you need to transport equipment, it's a huge operation. Usually, one person like me, we hire firms to do this type of jobs. But usually, one person like me, at the beginning of any survey collection of the data, we go to field and we experience firsthand what does that mean. So, like in any country, it was very complex to arrive to different households, and the households are very poor. Poverty is a very concrete concept, and you feel the poverty in every aspect of the household. So you arrive to one of these households, and the infrastructure of the household is, in some cases, very precarious. The floor, the walls, the conditions are especially taxing for some families. So collecting data is a very interesting aspect, but it's very challenging.
Amazing. So here you are coming from, Vanderbilt or Harvard or the U.S. generally, right? And you're arriving and you're saying, I'm really interested in you and your child's education. But first, I'd like to know a little bit about your family circumstance, something along those lines, right? To be able to understand even how much resource families have.
Yes. And there are two ways to think about this. Poverty can be an income measure. You can measure how much the family has in income, let's say, every month. But that measure is very difficult to get. You are asking people how much do they earn or the wages, and that is very difficult. So usually what we do is we observe the characteristics of the household. And with those characteristics, we are able to create indexes like that. There are proxies for this idea of poverty. And actually, that is a very concrete technique that a lot of governments are using. Is they, instead of asking about income or consumption, they ask about the characteristics of the household. What is the material of the floor? What is how many kids do you have in the household? So you have different measures of physical evidence, physical attributes of the household, but also what we call human accumulation. What is the education of the mother? What is the number of kids in the household? And from that, you can create indexes and you can have a proxy for poverty.
Amazing. So you've outlined that really elegantly in a recent paper. Congratulations on your first authored article in the Journal of Policy and Management that's just come out in 2024. And the title of that article, in case anybody's interested in going to read it, is Long-Term Impacts of Primary School Scholarships, Evidence from Cambodia. And you outline this in Table 1, where you suggest, that this is the right way to think about what families have and what they can use in their lives, rather than, what we would use in the U.S., which is to ask a family about their monthly earnings or to look at their tax statements, right?
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. Can you just read us a couple of items and how much or how many people, what proportion of the sample have those things, just to give the audience a bit of a sense, to paint a picture of, where we're thinking about education?
So, for instance, we ask what is the number of minors in the household, and the number of minors in the households can range from 1.7 to 2. Two minors in the household.
So not huge families, not
huge families. Yeah. If they own motorcycle is super important in Cambodia because it's the mean to transport yourself, and if you produce something to arrive to the market. So every household has less than one motorcycle. Some households have some motorcycle. If they own car or a truck, if they own a oxen or buffalo, if they own a pig, it turns out that owning pigs in Cambodia is a very important element that households can have and create wealth. So every household in Cambodia has less than one pig.
Or only a fraction of households have at least one pig.
Yes. And if they have a hard roof, if they have a hard wall, if they have hard floor. And these capture a lot of the, as we were saying, the level of poverty of the house.
Amazing. Okay, so here you've given us a really clear indication that this is not the same as looking at education in U.S. districts in either Baltimore or, Tulsa or name another small city or a rural area in the U.S., right? Very different context. So tell us a little bit about this study. I think you frame it really beautifully on page 33. Would you mind just reading us that first? This study has investigated, starting right there.
Sure.
It's just a great description of the study.
This study has investigated the long-term impact of a scholarship program that increases schooling with a particular focus on links between schooling, the development of cognitive and socio-emotional skills, and labor market and well-being outcomes later in life. To this end, we evaluate the effect of a primary school scholarship program in rural Cambodia 9 years after the program inception, tracking student participants when they were on average 21 years old.
Amazing. So you take kids in school and you randomly assign schools or kids?
We randomize schools.
Okay. So you randomly assign some schools to getting one kind of scholarship based on need, and another group of schools, another kind of scholarship based on merit, because kids are doing well in those schools.
Yes.
And some schools that don't get the scholarship right now, but they may get the scholarship some other time, right?
Yes.
And then you follow those same students out of school and into adulthood, right, for 9 years. And then you detect what is the impact of that investment, right? That offer, that essentially investment of a scholarship.
Yes.
Okay.
I have to say something that, at least for me, is very important. These studies require a lot of man and woman power. We work with co-authors, especially this one, my co-author, Dion Filmer, and Andrea De Barro. Andrea is a terrific.
These are your co-authors?
Those are my two co-authors. And these studies, as we were mentioned, they are very difficult to create. But in any case, so the root of the study was when I was at the World Bank. Dion was working very close with the Cambodia government. And the Cambodia government has one question, which is, what will be more effective, to give a scholarship based on merit or to give it based on poverty? So those two scholarships are very different. And related to one point that you made that is very important is the context is very different, Cambodia and United States, but the questions, and we believe the mechanisms, are similar in both contexts. So we are trying to do a very difficult trick, which is investigating these questions that can be generalizable, but in a specific context. And you need to separate what is the specificity of the context vis-a-vis what can you be general to other countries. So that question of how do you target if it's merit-based or poverty is extremely relevant to the United States and at that moment to the government of Cambodia.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the things that I'd love you to talk a little bit about is when we think about making that kind of investment, my guess is that it's with the assumption that if we provide families with a bit of resource, it'll motivate them to make schooling more important than all of the other things going on in their lives, right? That maybe they're dealing with a seasonal farming need, an agricultural need where they need kids to be working with the family in that rural context to help bring in whatever has been planted, right?
Yes.
Or alternately, maybe they need their kids to care for elderly family members, right? So the goal of that scholarship, tell me if I'm right, is to help to really highlight and motivate families to understand that education is an incredibly important thing to spend time doing.
Yes. And you mentioned two elements that are very important. One is what we call the opportunity cost. So we are giving money families saying, hey, we realize that sometimes it's very difficult to send your kid to school because there is an opportunity cost. You can put the kid to work the land. And again, we are in the context of rural area in Cambodia. And that possibility is very clear there. So we are saying to the family, hey, we are going to give you some money that at least reduce that opportunity cost. But also that money can have this effect that is motivating the household to invest more in education. It has this idea that we are telling the household education is important. It's an important investment. And that is another family of programs that are very important in Latin America and other parts of the world, which are called conditional cash transfers. So this is the programs that we are trying to say to the family, it's important to invest in education. We are going to help you. It is a social contract. And we are going to transfer money, usually to low-income families, so that they can invest in human capital.
Now we get to talk about what you found, right? I mean, Felipe, it's so cool because you did this so carefully. Right? You have these two different ways of thinking about scholarship funding. And by the way, I noted that the scholarships were $20.
They are very small. They are very small. For United States, it's almost 2 coffees. For Cambodia, can be some money in rural area.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, maybe half a pig.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we start thinking about, on one hand, you could say, well, $20 isn't going to make any difference. But it's important in that context, from the framework that you just laid out, maybe $20 is actually quite substantial.
It is. Actually, we are surprised with the results in one way. Another point that I want to make, talking about collection of data, this is 9 years after we did the experiment. So we have to go back to Cambodia. Again, we work with very specialized collecting firms, survey collecting firms in the countries. That is something fundamental to find a good firm to collect data. But we went back and to reach these households was very difficult.
I'm sure.
It was a tremendous effort. There is a lot of mobility in low-income households, but we were able to collect this data. And the results are amazing, even if the amount is very little. The families who received the scholarship, both of them, increased number of years of education, which
Amazing.
by itself is very important.
Right. So just pause there. I mean, I think, right, that's an amazing thing that you found, right? That you did, in fact, find evidence that scholarship increased education. Right?
Yes.
So kids did stay longer in school because of that scholarship.
And this is for both scholarships, for merit and for poverty. So a kid that received the scholarship because he performed well in a standardized test, increased years of education equally as a person who received the scholarship for being poor.
Amazing.
Yes.
And non-trivial, right? So if I read that sentence on page 23 where you report your results, you have this great sentence that specifies what you just said. Across all indicators, the scholarships had consistently statistically positive impact on the acquisition of formal education. And then you give the 4.4% increase in the number of grade students complete. But then you have this great second finding, an increase in the probability of completing primary school by 8 percentage points compared to a control mean of 57%, or a 14% increase, and an increase in the probability of receiving any formal education during 2011 to 2017 of 6.8 percentage points from a base of 75%. So roughly, it says, from as I understand it, that the control group who didn't get the scholarship, they had a 57% chance of completing primary school.
Yes.
Which
57% of the control group finished grade 6. Yes.
Great. Okay, so just over half of the control group finished grade 6.
Yes. Yes. That also reflects one point, which is the level of school acquisition in Cambodia is very low.
And this experiment, this small investment made on the basis of either merit or on the basis of family need, increased that by about 10 percentage points.
Yes,
is that about right?
Which is quite big. Yes.
Really big, right? So, I think we know that economics is often referred to as the dismal science because, right?
Sometimes we give good news, yes.
Because often there's not such good news, but this was really great news.
Yes.
How did it feel to find that you engaged with a group of communities to substantially increase kids' likelihood of completing primary school?
It's very humbling. When I do this type of experiments, you start thinking, will I impact the life of people? Will I really move the needle? And sometimes you do. And it is a quite extraordinary feeling. I have another program in Colombia in which we did a conditional cash transfer program. And 3 years after we started the program, I visit the country and I run into one of the beneficiaries. Mm-hmm. And she remembered me because I was the person in charge of the randomization of the lottery in front of the community. And she said to me, you cannot imagine the change that this program did in my life. The change in the conditions of my household dramatically improved. And it was because of the program that you did, which was not my program. It was the government program. But those feelings are amazing.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Felipe. It's such a, I think, important message for us to really sit with for a minute, right?
Yes.
I think we often think about the life of a professor as teaching students, which is super important, and we'll get to that, or running analyses on large data sets, or supervising grad students, or figuring out how to get a paper submitted for publication. And it's great to hear you really sort of zoom out from that and talk about both the humbling and the deeply emotionally moving experience of changing people's lives, or at least measuring appropriately how government programs can change people's lives.
And somehow I am very lucky because the type of research that I do is it has very concrete impact in policy. And that is a very powerful idea. When you try to connect research with the actual implementation of policies, it's very direct, the link with what you are doing and the effect on people. And I am in that realm. And there are other people that do other things that are important. But in this realm, I can see the effect on people, which is a great source of pride and happiness. And that is one important component of my research.
Amazing. And so when you think about that, you just described that parent standing there watching you conduct the lottery. And I'd love to just take a minute to talk about the methods that you use, right? Because we could immediately think, wow, you're randomly assigning families to getting something special or not getting that thing. Is that unfair? Shouldn't you have distributed it to everybody? So how does that work? And how does the community respond? Do they understand that there isn't enough for everybody to get the good thing, and therefore lotteries are fair? Or is there a feeling that you are experimenting with the community?
We do these lotteries a lot of the times for practical reasons, in the sense that we don't have resources enough for all the people that they need it. But there is still another important aspect of that, which is, let me go back to the example of Cambodia. We don't know if it's better to produce a merit-based or a poverty-based. And from the point of view of the government, the resources are limited and the opportunity cost of the resources are huge. So we need to start digging into these questions, and we need to start finding if one is better than the other. So from that point of view, to have a method that for sure tell me that the impact of the policy is this, it is very important. So we do it for those two reasons. But one point is that sometimes randomizations, lotteries, are the fairest way to assign resources. Why? Because the probability of receiving the good is equal ex ante for everyone. So it is very equal, and that is an important component of the lottery. Of course, I don't dismiss, and I think seriously about ethical considerations of randomizations of lotteries. I think that there are important questions there, and I think that researchers like me needs to think very carefully about the ethical considerations, but those are the fundamentals for doing these methods.
Makes perfect sense, right? Because you could have found that the merit-based or the poverty-based scholarship had a negative consequence for families, right?
Yes.
So you actually, from my perspective, are really taking a very careful and very considered look rather than assuming that the scholarship is going to work for everybody in the same way.
Yes. And actually we found in that experiment that even though the two scholarships increase human capital acquisition, the two type of kids increase education, only the merit one produce cognitive effects. So that is important by itself. And that is one case in which you start thinking, okay, how can we structure a scholarship that, let's say, maximize the benefit? And that is one of the objectives of the paper.
Yeah, fascinating. I read that part very carefully, of course. And I was interested because, what you're determining or describing as cognitive measures are measures of children's ability to demonstrate what they've learned, right?
Yes.
Vocabulary and essentially their capacity to show what they've learned on a test.
Yes.
And I thought it was fascinating that students who have received the signal that, that their effort and their accomplishment on those tests is seen. You see them, right? It's a very interesting signal. I see your effort. I see your hard work, and you're getting this scholarship because we know you're working hard.
Yes.
It's just a very interesting. Do you have a sense of the mechanisms there?
The mechanism is essentially that you are saying to a student, we believe in you. And that's why we are giving you this scholarship. And mind you, the two groups that were recipients of the scholarship, both groups were very poor. But one group, we say, okay, you will receive it because we believe your household needs support. We believe that you need this money, basically. That's the poverty one. And the other one, we say, the implicit message was, we believe that you can do the work, that we believe in you, in your ability. And that triggered a very different response. The merit one had impacts on cognitive, even if those merit were among the poorest of the poorest.
Yes.
So that is fascinating.
Totally. And then tell us a little bit about why you think you didn't find any impact on employment. Is it because no one in the village is working, or everyone in the village is working, or that there really isn't a detectable effect of that small investment 9 years earlier on employment? Because that was fascinating to me, that you found null effects. You found no statistically significant impact of the intervention on employment.
There is one hypothesis, if I can say that, which is the following, is that this is early entry in the labor market. And perhaps at early stages, it is difficult to detect difference in labor, and more at the light that we increase the education progression of these individuals. So perhaps these individuals enter a little bit later to the labor market than the control group, and the control group experience matter in the labor market. So perhaps the control group at that stage have higher wage than the kids that receive the scholarship. That is a hypothesis. We cannot truly test that, but that is an explanation.
It's fast. I mean, one of those things that we always have to remind people, right? That no statistically significant difference doesn't mean it didn't work.
Yeah.
To state three double negatives.
Yes.
It just means we didn't detect that it did work.
Yes.
And I love that you are posing, maybe it's because it's too early. Maybe it's because at 21, as students are just entering the labor market, things haven't evened out.
But something that we find is that the well-being, a measure of happiness, if we can say that, the measure of well-being, how do they feel about life, is higher in the people who receive the scholarship than the people who didn't receive the scholarship. So that is something that is also very promising.
Absolutely. What possessed you? What led you to include a measure of happiness? As an economist, that is not what I expected to have seen in this paper, right? Usually, not to, tease my econ friends, but usually there's a very strong emphasis on labor market outcomes and not on mental health and well-being running right parallel alongside labor market outcomes. So what led you to include measures of happiness in this study?
Oh, Cybele, this is a discussion that is in the profession, but economists from long time has been interested in well-being, in the well-being of individuals. And the things that we can measure very clear are labor market, but that doesn't mean that there is no interest in well-being. Moreover, there are a group of economists working in happiness. So why we measure well-being? We thought that it was an important measure. We thought that we believe in education that create individuals that are that can explore their own potential and that can grow as an individual, not only in the labor market, but as a person, as a citizen. And that's why we measured that variable.
In another paper on families in Mexico, you actually had fascinating findings about an intervention that backfired, right?
Yes.
That when we think about parent involvement, for example, you shifted from looking at what the impact of a scholarship is for students to what the impact of support for families to be more involved. Can you tell me about the two different arms of that experiment, the two different assignments that different families or different communities received, and what you learned in terms of what works and what might not work in supporting families to support their students, their children in learning?
So this is another experiment in Mexico. And the fundamental idea of that experiment is families perhaps do not have the information of how invest in the education of their kids. We believe that a family that get involved in the education of the kid can be very powerful and can increase the education of an individual. In United States, that idea is very prominent. Families that get involved in the schools can induce the students to perform better. And around the world, we try to look at that. So in Mexico, we have this experiment, which is one group of families. We invite them to receive a light touch information session about how can they help the kids, how can they go to the school and talk with the principal, what resources the government had that they can reach out to improve the schools. That was one arm. The other one was an arm in which we give the Parents Association, in general terms, money so that they can invest in the school. So Parents Association in these schools are, again, in rural area, very tough conditions. These families receive money from the government, and we give them extra money. We say, hey, here is some money, and we give them the same type of information to those two families.
So one is sort of directly to parents for something like homework help or making sure that your child is able to get to school on time and able to get home safely and able to focus on the value of learning, family-specific support learning at home as well as at school. Yes. And the other is more like a PTA, right?
Yes.
This parent associations that you said, the PTA, instead of having to raise money through a bake sale as we would in the U.S., we're actually going to double the amount of funds they have to be able to be engaged and involved with school. Is that about right?
It is totally correct. Yeah.
Okay, so the experiment runs.
The experiment runs, and 3 years later, we tried to detect what were the impact of the experiment. And the results are not that positive in one sense. Nothing happened with the learning of the kids. The second thing that we find is that nothing happened with with how the teachers behave in the classroom. And let me pause here 3 seconds. When you give more money to the PTA, the idea was that the PTA go to the school and say, hey, we have more money. What do we do with the money? They cannot invest in salaries of teachers. They can invest in any other thing. But the idea was like, when the parents have more money, there is a better communication between the parents and the school. And the parents can talk with the principal and they can say, hey, do you have a problem? From physical problems, there is a window that is broken and they have the money to repair the window, or that they need some sort of materials to run an activity in the class.
More school supplies.
Yes.
More, a field trip, something like that.
So the idea was that it will change the dynamic of the school and it will improve the condition of the school. If the teacher has to arrive to the classroom and the classroom has the window broken, that is very different if the teacher arrives and the window is repaired.
So it just make the teaching conditions for the teacher better.
Yes.
And parents would feel more empowered and engaged. That was the hypothesis.
Yes.
Okay. So then, this is the beauty of experiments, right? What happened?
It didn't happen. The teacher didn't change. Something that was interesting was that in the money treatment, the parents were able to, what we describe, sit in the table in the decision of the school more.
They had a seat at the table.
Yes.
Okay.
But but the school didn't change in a fundamental way. We were able to demonstrate that actually parents get more involved in the school. But again, no change in the learning of the students. So we were puzzled. We will say, hey, how come the parents are going more to the school? But we found that everything pinned down to trust. So in the information experiment, we were able to increase trust between the parents and the school. In the money experiment, the trust decreased. And that is a potential mechanism to explain that result.
So fascinating. So in the condition where parents are now supported to do homework help or to have more information about how to be engaged, those parents actually increased their level of trust. That intervention increased their level of trust in the schools and the school's sense of their being partners.
Yes.
But in the other, it actually was negative, right? It was what we call an iatrogenic effect, right? You actually generated an unfortunate consequence, right? Which is now parents trust teachers less than the control group.
Yes. And
fascinating.
Teacher trust less the parents.
The parents. And do you think that was a generalizable result? You were talking about making people's lives better, right? In this case, that mechanism suggests that if you come in with good intentions, but you're not careful about measuring the results, you could actually create a little bit more chaos in a school system.
Yes, and that is the 1 million question, and it's very difficult to answer. We don't know if these particular results are very context specific. Mexico, we are talking about indigenous population, and there is that create a very context aspect of this intervention. Usually in Mexico, it's very difficult for the parents to enter the school. They are not welcome. And that's why we want to do this, is we want to induce the parents to go to the school, and we try to do that. And again, it didn't happen, and actually backfired in the money intervention. You asked me Do you think that that can be generalizable to our context? And that is more difficult.
Yes.
And I don't have an answer to that. Which is fine.
Perfectly reasonable, Felipe. That's
totally
you being
fine.
a very, very careful scientist, right? But I think it also speaks to the context that you're describing. Sounds like one we would want to know more from different disciplines. Does there serve a purpose then to have a sociologist or an anthropologist or, someone who's really versed in indigenous culture in Mexico to help us understand that context of trust and authority and organizations. It's fascinating to me to think about how each of us, through my lens as a PhD in psychology, your lens as a PhD in econ, we can think about all the other lenses that we would want to understand that context. It's fascinating.
And I think that's a very important point. And I am totally believe in that point, which is what we need is more interdisciplinary work. These type of projects require a lot of people. I have 3 other co-authors here, Harry Patrinos, Paul Gertrude, and a fantastic student of mine, Nozomi Nakanijima. We all are economists, and we perhaps will have a lot of help from other perspectives. We didn't have it. But I think that interdisciplinary work is very important.
Amazing. And so tell us a little bit, Felipe, about how you ended up here. How did you end up as an economist focusing on education in international contexts? This is a way in which you've shaped your expertise and your talent and your viewpoint so that you can use these amazing tools, these econometric and experimental tools in these policy contexts. But I think it's really helpful sometimes to ask what led you from life as a student to life as a scholar.
I am going to tell you 2 things that are very concrete. When I was a student in economics in Colombia, I was thinking about inflation. I was thinking it's something totally different. And I arrived to a class with Gary Becker. And the first class of Becker was about how families invest in education and human capital. And that was my PhD. And it changed everything in my life. Because I went out of that class saying why I was thinking that inflation was interesting. And I started discovering all these very interesting things about how families invest. So from that point, I started obsessing with that question. But then I went back to Colombia and I started working in Colombia doing consultancy and research. I didn't enter to a university because I believe firmly in research that have concrete impact in countries. So that link, that nexus between research and policy for me was very important. And after that, I arrived to the World Bank. And in the World Bank, it was the same idea, not only in Colombia, but in the whole world open to me. My first task in the World Bank was in Pakistan. Then I started working in Mexico. Then I started working in Cambodia. But the same tools apply to everywhere. And the same questions were very present in everywhere. So at the World Bank, I started working with a more global perspective. And then accidents happen and I end up in academia. So it's a very, my road to here is not a typical road of finishing your PhD and entering academia. I have an exposure to policy in one fundamental way. I was never in the government, but I work very closely with government.
Amazing. I think when we think about government we think about impact, we think, the way to have impact is to enter government. And it's less clear. I think it's more opaque. That there are many ways to have impact on policy that don't involve being necessarily in a governmental public sector role, but being adjacent to those roles and actually generating a ton of knowledge for those roles. Really interesting.
The power of knowledge. And that requires a policymaker that is willing to listen to knowledge.
Well said.
Which is increasingly difficult to find. But anyway.
So tell me a little bit about the huge amount of work that you've done on public-private partnership in Colombia, because obviously you have a very large corpus of work that's happening in that country, but also that I think serves as this remarkable level of both draws on probably your own personal experience being from that country, but also tremendously on your expertise that you've just described so elegantly. So tell us a little bit about those partnerships and what you're learning.
So when I returned to Colombia, one of my first jobs in FEDesarrollo was the World Bank contract FEDesarrollo to study a new type of schools that were being implemented in Bogota. These schools were public schools, received money from the public, but with two characteristics that are important. These schools are the provision of the service whereby well-reputed, well-established, high-quality private schools. So a private school that was very good school in Bogota in one area decided to also provide the service in another school in a very low-income neighborhood. And that was the program that the government of Bogota implemented. The second thing is these schools, public schools, couldn't choose their students. The government gave the list of students to these providers. And these were a new experiment in Bogota, a new innovation in education. And
so just to slow us down for 1 second.
Yes.
So this is the equivalent of sort of aligned with U.S. charter schools. This is a private school operator, shall we say, who's now being funded by the government to provide services and educational supports, run a new school for public school students who are attending a separate school. This is not a voucher program for those lower income kids to attend the private school. This is a program where basically the operators of the private school are now are extending their service delivery to a new public school. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
With let me say a couple of things. One, again, these are private providers that have proven to be of excellent.
Got it.
So it is kind of a charter school, but if you are going to be the provider, you have to demonstrate that you are an exceptionally good private school.
Got it. So high selectivity on who gets to have these contracts.
The second thing is that the contract itself has element of quality. So you are not saying to the provider, hey, here are some kids, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
They are saying, hey, there are some kids. First of all, they are low income. All of them are low income. And you have to prove that they can progress, they can learn, and that the probability of entering university is high. So
Got it.
there are clauses in the contract that are quality oriented, and the providers are amazing. So yes, it is like a charter school. However, with a heavy emphasis in the contract and in the selection of the providers.
Okay, so fast forward. What do we know about these partnerships? Success, right? We've just talked about those moments where these policy innovations work, and those moments where these policy innovations backfire. What are you finding?
So my first evaluation was a long time ago, and I found positive effects. But that evaluation was not with the same techniques as we were describing of lotteries. And I keep thinking, okay, we need to evaluate these schools in a more scientific way. And several years later, I was able to convince the local government to do a proxy of a lottery. Still, there is some targeting. Still, the kids that goes there are chosen based off an poverty index, similar to the one that we described in Cambodia. But what we did, we create pairs of kids that were absent in these indexes, and one received the offer to go to this school and the other not, by chance.
Okay, so pairs of kids. So you paired kids up, not to their knowledge, I assume. They didn't know they were paired.
They don't know. They apply. The government has information about these kids, about these indices.
Yeah, you make 2 lists.
We meet the
flipping
list.
A coin.
Yes. With money from the National Science Foundation, we were able to measure the 1-year effect of this program. And the effects are quite large in any measure that you can measure. We are measuring kids that are entering this school, very young kids, about the age of the kids that you study, Cybele. But they are entering the school, and the effects are impressive in terms of cognitive outcomes, in terms of socio-emotional outcomes, in terms of the satisfaction of the family. And these effects are very large, very
Amazing.
large.
And when you say large, help us to put that in context. I mean, many educational interventions show 1 or 2 points change on a given measure of kids' ability to learn vocabulary, for example, or 1 or 2 months greater learning, as if they had spent 1 or 2 more months in school relative to the children in the control group. When you say large effects, help us to understand what you mean.
See, you ask very complex questions. So let me start with socio-emotional. What we measure is 0.3 standard deviation in socio-emotional. 0.3 standard deviation in education intervention is in the size that is large.
Yes.
In terms of cognitive, is smaller, is 0.2. But still, is an important impact. We measure the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, PPVT. That measure has a scale that is around, the mean was 90 points in my sample, and we increased it to around 97, 99 points.
Great. So if you're raising kids almost 10 points on a standardized measure of vocabulary, that means they're showing a lot more ability in their language skills, right?
Yes. And it's a fundamental measure of cognitive skill.
Yes, absolutely. So amazing. So you've opened the watch. You've moved a bunch of gears, because now it's not just parent involvement. It's not just scholarship funding. It's actually a completely different set of school policies and school quality. And you're finding big effects, right? So does that indicate that we shouldn't mess around with one gear at a time? Or does that suggest that, how do we think about that in terms of school reform and think about in terms of school investments?
Oh, that's so interesting. So you are right. The approach that a lot of economists are doing and we were doing is we change one input at a time, one of the gears at a time, and we try to see what happened. However, these type of interventions are very complex interventions. It's not one gear. It's you change the watch.
Yes.
So, and that goes to the topic of the organization of the education system. It is not only you are going to, let's say a simple one, you are going to put more computers in a school. It is to the question of how do you organize a education system? Because we are talking about these private providers that provide public education. And that changed the system in fundamental ways. For instance, now the kids have more choice. A poor kid in a neighborhood can decide, okay, will I want to go to this school or should I go to the typical public school? So it changed a choice, but it also changed the way the government has to think about how to assign money. And that is a more systemic type of question.
Felipe, thank you so much for joining me today on Quantum Potential. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Remember to stay curious. Keep exploring new ideas. We'll be back next time with another guest who's pushing the boundaries of discovery. Until then, I'm Cybele Raver, and this is Quantum Potential.
The Quantum Potential podcast comes from Vanderbilt University. Your host is C. Cybele Raver. Thank you to our guest, Felipe Barrera-Osorio. Production by Matriarch Digital Media. For more information about quantum potential, go to vanderbilt.edu/quantum potential. Stay curious.